Greetings my chess friends, and welcome to this little chess video. We have before us a position from the 1993 United States Championship. With the white pieces is Grandmaster Roman Zindahashvili, and with the black pieces is Grandmaster Alexander Yarmolinsky. The question that I'm going to ask you is, can you read this chessboard? In other words, can you accurately evaluate this chess position? Now you see what normally happens when we are confronted with a position like this is we look at individual moves, or we try to calculate variations. However, I'd like to introduce to you a system advocated by International Master Jeremy Silman, where we try to discern the imbalances in the position prior to looking at candidate moves and prior to calculating variations. And the way we do this is by considering the imbalances that might exist between minor pieces, pawn structure, space, material, files and squares, development and initiative. So let me illustrate these concepts to you in the hope that when you look at a chess position, you simply don't look at individual moves or try simply to calculate variations, but that you try to ascertain a proper evaluation of the chess position prior to looking at these types of moves. Please take a look at this chess position here, and it illustrates the imbalances that exist between knights and bishops, so-called minor pieces. And we can see that this bishop here on d4 is a much better piece than the knight on f7. It dominates these diagonals. It has a target on a7, and it works well in conjunction with other pieces. For example, this rook could come here and reach b7 and attack this target here on a7. So it's a much better piece than the knight. And this illustrates, of course, the imbalance that exists between minor pieces. Let us look at this little instance. We have kept the same pawn structure essentially, but we have exchanged the bishop on d4 for a white knight, and we've given black a dark squared bishop. But we can see that this knight absolutely dominates the dark squared bishop. It has an excellent outpost here on e6. It puts pressure against the c7 pawn, and it works well in conjunction with other pieces. For example, again, this rook could come to b1 and to b7, where it attacks these pawns. So again, this illustrates the disparity or the imbalance that exists between minor pieces. Please take a look at this position. It highlights another aspect that we need to take into consideration when we evaluate a chess position, and that is, of course, pawn structure. We can see that white has doubled pawns here on the c-file, and it represents, of course, an imbalance. This pawn here on c3 is very safe. However, this pawn here on c4 is further advanced and will probably come under attack, probably if the knight reaches the square here on a5. But with all things, there are pros and cons. Although double pawns does reduce the mobility of pawns, we can see that because of the exchange that it has occurred here on c4, there is now a half open b file. And this can be used, of course, by one of white's rooks. So yes, the mobility of the pawns has been reduced, but in compensation for this, white has gained a half open b file. So certainly there are pros and cons with regard to pawn structure, but it's certainly an idea that we need to take into consideration when we are evaluating a chess position. And this little instance here illustrates the matter at hand. Look at this position here, and you can certainly discern a disparity that exists in space. White has such a space advantage that black would be as well as resigning this position on the spot, simply because he has no valid moves for his minor pieces. He's all cramped up and he has nowhere to go. Now, if you could remove all of black's pieces, and the situation would be that the space advantage would be minimalized. In fact, it would probably be ineffectual, simply because the white pawns have nothing to cramp. So space is certainly something else that we need to consider when we are evaluating a chess position, and this, of course, exaggerated illustration illustrates that for us perfectly. Now, the fourth imbalance that we would wish to consider is that of material. Owning pieces of greater value than that of one's opponent. Now, please take a look at this position here just for a moment. We can see that black has an extra pawn and he is up the exchange, and he has a material advantage. However, because of the dynamics of the position, it's easy to see that white will in fact be the winner and it's black who will suffer, because material in a point count sense is not always an advantage. However, it does exist as a type of imbalance, and we would want to consider that when we are evaluating any position. The fifth imbalance is open files and weak squares. Now, have a look at this position just for a brief moment. We can see that there is, of course, an open D file, and it would seem that whoever takes possession of this D file should be in good stead. Therefore, black dutifully plays rook to d8, occupying the open D file, which is generally a good idea. However, in this instance it runs into bishop to e3, attacking this undefended pawn. Pawn advances, and eventually it is, of course, white who ends up occupying the open file. And as soon as this rook moves, white will possibly be able to penetrate along the 7th rank. So we can see the power of the open file and how it provides a significant imbalance that in some instances can be used. Now, the last 2 points that we should consider are these temporary imbalances: development and initiative. And sometimes you can exchange some other element for development and for initiative. For example, in the case of a gambit, we are prepared to exchange material so that we can get a lead in development. And here we have exchanged the pawn in order to get a lead in development. And here we can see that white, of course, has 3 pieces developed to black's 1. And sometimes this lead in development can translate into an initiative. For example, in this position, if black foolishly plays knight to f6, then white gets an initiative after the move e5. And if black foolishly takes, then this lead in development and this initiative is a very dangerous element indeed. So we certainly need to take this imbalance into consideration when we are evaluating a chess position. So let's go back to our original position and let us see if we can put these elements together so as to form a proper evaluation of the chess position, and so that we can formulate a plan, and so that that plan influences our choice of moves. Well, we can see that black owns 2 bishops. So this represents an imbalance in minor pieces, and especially black has a dark square bishop which has no counterpart. And this bishop is, of course, putting pressure on the e5 point. Pawn structure, well, black has no weaknesses, and it would seem that the weakest pawn on the board is in fact the e5 point, simply because it's so far advanced and needs to be defended by pieces. Space, well, this pawn of course confers upon white more space, but it's not entirely clear how he can take advantage of this space at present. Material is even, both have 2 rooks, 3 minor pieces and a queen each, and the same number of pawns. Files and squares, well, we can see that there is of course this open d file, but none of the players have as yet managed to occupy the file with a rook so as to take advantage of this. White of course has a lead in development, but it's easy to see that black can castle quickly, so it's unlikely that white shall be able to take advantage of his slight lead in development. And as far as initiative goes, it's not entirely clear who has the initiative at present. So how do these imbalances help us look at planning so that we can look at specific moves? Well, because of the imbalance in minor pieces, it's clear to see that this dark square bishop has no counterpart, and it's exercising pressure against the e5 point. Therefore, it would be logical if black could somehow exacerbate the pressure on the e5 point, increase it to the point where white's position crumbles. White, on the other hand, has 2 knights, and he needs to try to make these knights superior to the black bishops. And the way of doing this is finding outposts for them, active outposts. You might consider, of course, the e4 square for one of his knights, but again it blocks the e-file and might make the defense of the e5 point more difficult, but he needs to activate these knights. He of course would love to get a knight to f6, but again it's not entirely easy, simply because the e5 point needs defending. So the ideas for both sides are fairly clear. Black should strive to keep the white knights at bay and increase the pressure on the e5 point, and white must increase the activity of his knights and of course defend the e5 point. Well, The moves that were actually made in the game, of course, highlight this. First of all, white played knight to b5, trying to activate his knight, and of course he attacks the c7 point. The black could defend the c7 point by bringing his knight to, of course, a square like a6, but this detracts from his idea. He would much rather have his knight on the d7 square where it pressurizes the e5 point. And for this reason he simply exchanges off this knight with bishop takes b5. Bishop takes, and black played c6. Now of course this creates a weakness on d6, but a weakness that cannot be exploited is not in reality a weakness at all. Now white of course would love to use this square for his knight, but he needs to defend the e5 point at present. Bishop c4 was played, and the knight came to d7 where it pressurizes the e5 point. Black defended with queen to d4, and here black played the excellent queen to c5, threatening to swap off another defender of the e5 point. Queens were exchanged, and white tried to dominate the open d file. Of course black contested this, rooks were exchanged, and the black king found a home on e7. h4 gaining kingside space, rook to d8 contesting the d file, and here white played rook to e1. Rather than exchange rooks on d8, he needs this rook to defend the e5 point. a5, b3, e4, g4. Now the idea of this is to provide an avenue for the white king so that it can come up and to f4 and defend the e5 point, and hopefully relieve some of these pieces of this defensive responsibility so that they can become more active. Knight d7 putting more pressure on the e5 point. King to g2 was played. Knight b6. King to g3. Here's an interesting moment. Would you use your knight to exchange this light square bishop? Well, considering our plan is to put pressure on the e5 point, there would be no point in exchanging this knight for this bishop, because this bishop can never be a defender of the e5 point, whereas this knight can certainly put pressure on it. Rook to a8 was played, knight to d2, a takes b3, bishop takes b3, rook to d8 putting pressure on the undefended knight, knight f3, knight to d7 was played, putting pressure on the e5 point again, king to f4, rook to a8, rook to e2, and here the rook came to the excellent a5. And we can see all of white's pieces are conspiring to put pressure on the e5 point. And this marks the culmination of his strategy. So we can see how a proper evaluation of the chess position by means of considering the imbalances led to a strategic plan which could be fulfilled. It was purposeful, and I think it's an excellent idea to adopt, that rather than simply looking at candidate moves and looking at variations, that we try to get a proper evaluation of the position by means of these imbalances, so that we can formulate a plan and so that our moves, our chess moves, can be in harmony with our strategic aims. And I think this game and this little series of videos illustrates that perfectly. So hopefully you guys found it useful, and it needs some practice, of course, in order to get used to it, but it's well worth the effort. So once again, I thank you very much for taking the time to watch this chess video, and I do wish you well with your own chess.